Welcome everyone to this week's edition of Generation Jihad. I'm Bill Roggio, and always I'm joined this week with my colleague and friend, Tom Joscelyn.
How you doing, everybody?
While everyone rightfully remains focused on the threat of the coronavirus, it has been a busy week in the world of terrorism. We're going to switch things up this week and discuss several recent events. On the docket today is a reward issued by the State Department for a top-level Hezbollah commander who is directing Iranian-backed Shia militias in Iraq.
And Bill, we're going to talk about your time in Iraq just a little bit and tracking those Shiite militias. And we're also going to talk about a series of infographics that were released by an al-Qaeda affiliated media outfit that are intended to highlight al-Qaeda's global operations, including in Afghanistan, where we know al-Qaeda really doesn't exist anymore, right, Bill? Wink, wink.
Right. Of course, al-Qaeda has never been in Afghanistan.
Not in years. Not in years, according to Taliban apologists. Go ahead, Bill. Next.
This week, the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan released a video that exposes its historical links to the Afghan Taliban and other foreign terrorist groups. This is very timely, given our discussion last week on Generation Jihad about the Pakistani Taliban and Pakistan's ties to various Taliban groups, good Taliban, bad Taliban, etc.
Yeah, we're also going to talk about this plot in Germany that was thwarted. It was an ISIS plot against U.S. military facilities there, and there are a lot of interesting angles, but we're going to focus on Tajikistan and ISIS's recruiting in Central Asia, because that's sort of a story that we think is going to keep coming up. We're also going to talk about other ISIS-related news in Afghanistan and Syria, so there's a lot to cover. So, Bill, why don't we start with the State Department's $10 million bounty for this guy you've been tracking for a while, this Hezbollah commander in Iraq, and tell us what that's all about.
Yeah. So on April 10th, the State Department's Rewards for Justice program, they issued a $10 million bounty for information on Mohammed Kawatharni. He's a Hezbollah commander who has stepped up his activities in Iraq since the U.S. killed Qasem Soleimani, who, of course, was the commander of Quds Force. This is Iran's expeditionary military unit that directs its insurgencies throughout the Middle East. And the U.S. killed Soleimani in an airstrike in early January. Kawatharni is a known figure. Treasury designated him as a global terrorist back in 2013. And I want to put this $10 million reward into perspective. This places him at the top tier of state's most wanted terrorists. There's only one individual who has a higher bounty, and that is al-Qaeda's Emir Ayman al-Zawahiri. So Kawatharni is on par with these are individuals who also have $10 million bounties. Saif al-Adil from al-Qaeda, he was their military commander and a top-level leader. Yassin al-Suri, al-Qaeda's operations chief in Iran, another senior al-Qaeda leader.
Yeah, we don't actually know where he is today, right? Yassin al-Suri. Yeah. He's a guy we're going to talk about in the future because he's disappeared off the radar, but I'm curious as to where he is. But yeah.
He is a ghost. Lashkar-e-Taiba's Hafez Saeed, and also the Taliban's deputy emir, Sirajuddin Haqqani. There are others on the list, but I think that tells you exactly what state thinks of Kawatharni and his importance in this global jihad.
And at the very minimum, it shows you what the State Department's priorities are anyway. In terms of going after these guys on sanctions lists and otherwise.
Yeah, and in the designation, and this is a quote, they describe Kawatharni as a senior leader of Hezbollah's forces in Iraq, and he has taken over some of the political coordination of Iran-aligned paramilitary groups formerly organized by Soleimani, of course, is the slain Quds Force commander. Soleimani was instrumental in standing up these pro-Iranian Shia militias. Hezbollah has played a key role in this. Iran used the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 to up its game. So it always has historically tried to support Shia groups inside of Iraq against Saddam Hussein. But the U.S. invasion in 2003 really opened up space for the Iranians to expand their influence. And to do this, Iran has leaned on Hezbollah, which Hezbollah, of course, is Iran's premier proxy. And these militias were organized with the help of Hezbollah leaders to be organized along the same lines as Lebanese Hezbollah. These militias are responsible for the deaths of over 600 American soldiers during the U.S. presence in Iraq. Most recently, these militias stepped up attacks on U.S. bases. In the last year, they've killed 3 U.S. soldiers and contractors, as well as a British soldier. And at the turn of the year, they attacked the U.S. Embassy. This attack on the embassy and the killing of U.S. soldiers is what spurred the U.S. to kill Qasem Soleimani.
So, what's interesting about this is it again demonstrates that Iran's playing two sides of the coin in Iraq as elsewhere at the same time, right? They're playing the military hand, and that has political objectives. So it's not just like they're committing attacks for the sake of committing attacks. They have political objectives in Iraq and elsewhere they're trying to achieve, and this guy's a good example of that in terms of the political influence he's attempting to wield there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Iran isn't just doing this to kill American soldiers and drive the U.S. out of Iraq. As you said, they're trying to expand their influence. They're trying to get the Iraqi government to get into the Iranian sphere. I mean, you could argue it's halfway there already. These militias are very powerful. When the Islamic State took over large areas of Iraq beginning in 2013. The Iraqi military failed. The Iraqi police failed. These militias had to step up and fight the Islamic State, and that gave them a lot of cachet, a lot of power. It gave them military power, but it also gave them a lot of political power. And these groups are dangerous. They don't only threaten groups like the Islamic State or the United States. They'll attack Iraqis, Iraqi politicians, Iraqi generals, Iraqi police commanders who don't play the game that the Iranians want. So it's what Iran is really doing here is they're particularly with the establishment of these militias is to create the Iraqi version of the IRGC or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, because that is the true power inside of Iran. And these militias, which are organized under what's called the Popular Mobilization Forces, they report directly to the prime minister. So it's very important for the Iranians to get a pro-Iranian prime minister. They're currently opposing the individual who is being proposed to be the Iraqi prime minister because he's not on board with this program. I'd expect this guy to leave the country or wind up dead at some point. So Iran plays a very sophisticated game. It's not just military. There's a political aspect, there's a cultural aspect, and there's also a commerce aspect to this as well. And it's a very, and this is one of the reasons why the precipitous withdrawal of U.S. forces from Iraq in 2011 really opened the door for the Iranians to expand. And you and I, Tom, we warned about this. We warned about the rise of these militias, how they would be dangerous. People dismissed us and said, no, they'll just be incorporated as part of the political system. They'll integrate into the Iraqi military, and the exact opposite has happened. And we're dealing with this threat. And there's one other point I'd like to bring up about this. And I think this is probably the most overlooked aspect. You look at Hezbollah, again, which is Iran's premier proxy inside of Lebanon. It has a population of 4 million to recruit from, and a large percentage of them are Shia, right? And look at what Hezbollah has done regionally. Look at how it opposes Israel and the problems and the wars that have broken out. In Iraq, there's about 36 million Iraqis. About 60% of them are Shia. That is the recruiting base that these militias that Iran has to try to get individuals into these militias and into this Iraqi IRGC. It's very dangerous. I don't think people are looking beyond this to see that you can have basically Hezbollah, times 100 if these militias are able to succeed in what the Iranians are trying to get them to do.
And we noticed early on, of course, and I know you were hot to trot on this story, Bill, because there was some pushback from people defending sort of the Iranian-backed role of militias in the Popular Mobilization Forces. But I know you were on this very early that Mohandas in particular, Abu Mahdi al-Mohandas, who was the last PMF commander, Population Mobilization Forces commander, he was clearly in the Iranian fold. I mean, he was killed alongside Soleimani, and nobody disputes that he was basically an Iranian agent at this point, a Quds Force agent. But this was one of the ways, right, Bill, that they carved out influence within Iraq. They used first the 2003 invasion, of course, the U.S. precipitous withdrawal, and then the fight against the Islamic State. They used that sort of triple whammy, really, to expand their military and political footprint in the country. And there's some pushback, of course. They're not dominating dominating everything, but they do have a lot of influence. But Mohandas and the PMF was one of the ways they did this. They basically used the security forces, the security sector, as a way to increase their hand, especially in the fight against ISIS.
Yeah, absolutely. And, look, the U.S. listed Mohandas, I believe, in 2009. They identified him as he was basically Soleimani's right hand. I mean, he was an advisor to Soleimani. He is without a doubt a member of Quds Force. You'd see him inside Iran, and he was treated as a high-level military commander. So Kawthani isn't the only Hezbollah commander to go in and to advise. There was one individual named Musa Ali Dakduk. He early on, also along with Kawthani and others, were instrumental in establishing the Shia militias. They worked with the Mahdi army, which of course is Muqtada al-Sadr, who, a very important religious figure. His father was a very important religious figure, and he sort of glommed on to his father's name. They worked with them, and then these militias as they exist now, they expanded from that, what the U.S. military called the special groups, or the Mahdi Army special groups, and that's how you got groups like Hezbollah brigades, which is obviously separate from Hezbollah, Asib al-Haq, and the Promised Day Brigade, which is actually Mahdi's recent incarnation of the Mahdi Army, and they did this intentionally, the Iranians, so that they could have. Basically, they didn't put all their eggs into one basket. So if the U.S. decides to target one group heavily, these other groups are going to exist. It's sort of a force multiplier effect, and it's a very, very clever strategy that the Iranians have. And again, what you have now is all these groups report in under the Popular Mobilizations Forces, again, which was led by Mohandas. So it's a clear indication of that the Iranians are pulling the strings in all of this.
Yeah, and this goes back years. I mean, I remember when you were embedded in Iraq, Bill, the reporting you were doing on the Iranian rat lines that were in Iraq at the time, where they were building up sort of concurrently building up their military or terrorist infrastructure along their political infrastructure. And you had these maps that the U.S. military was producing, I think, based on what those rat lines look like. And basically, I don't think they ever went away. They just kept regenerating them, when certain, key figures were taken out or perished for one reason or another. They had other guys to replace, and to replace them. And it sort of speaks to the whole problem here. I mean, we talk about on the Sunni side a lot that we don't really know, how many al-Qaeda leaders there are or how many ISIS leaders there are. We're always trumpeting these sort of senior figures who were killed. But with any insurgency or any sort of revolutionary type group, these sort of high value targeting, they're sort of necessary but not sufficient to defeat them. And of course, there's very limited targeting of Iran's proxies, really, and their proxy leaders throughout the region anyway. So, Bill, speak a little bit about those rat line maps. Yeah. And I'll go back in time. I think that was telling about what was going on. It was sort of the U.S. sort of, for a moment anyway, for a limited period of time, got that they had a sort of a two-pronged problem in Iraq, both from the Sunni side and the Shiite side. And it was the Shiite side, I think, is still not really fully understood.
Yeah, and so along with the surge, everyone says the surge was designed to defeat al-Qaeda in Iraq and give the Iraqi government space. It was also designed to target and defeat that Shia insurgency as well. And so in early 2007, someone leaked to me a map of what these rat lines look like. It was all, and yeah, as you mentioned, right, we could target, we could kill fighters on the ground, we could kill senior leaders. But without that safe haven, without addressing the issue of the safe haven, it really, we were really playing a version of whack-a-mole. And what this map showed was the military, U.S. military had a very clear picture of what this network looked like from Baghdad all the way south down to Basra. And you would see training camps and storage facilities inside of Iranian cities and towns along the border. And then they would pre-position across the border. Then they would move these storage sites or these munition sites, weapons caches. They put that forward, and then there would be attack zones. And the U.S. military actually, beginning in 2007 and through to about 2010, was, along with the Iraqi military, surprisingly, was heavily targeting these Shia groups. They targeted them so badly that Sadr and basically all the militia leaders just bugged out, and they, of course, bugged out to Iran. They laid low, and then once the U.S. withdrew, they started filtering back into Iraq, and within 2 years, their influence spread, and their militias came back. And this was all directed by what was known as the Ramadan Corps. It still is known as that. That's the IRGC corps that is assigned to deal with the Sunni insurgency, and as well as dealing with the political and cultural and religious aspects of expanding Iranian influence inside of Iraq.
Yeah, it's a pretty grim picture, obviously, moving forward. In any event, so let's move on to the next story. Let's move on to these infographics we've been tracking that al-Qaeda has been putting out on their websites, including Imad, one of their newer websites or forums they have. Bill, one of the things that we've been the Minority Report on for years is, of course, al-Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan, and we could definitely filibuster this week and probably every week on this episode because it's a issue that's near and dear to our hearts. But I think just in brief, what's interesting when we saw these infographics go out from al-Qaeda, and just for listeners to understand, put this in perspective a little bit, al-Qaeda usually doesn't advertise their presence in Afghanistan. There's an old article that al-Qaeda put out a while ago, which basically their policy is something they call not standing out. They realize that if they just don't announce their presence in different places, that will be enough to fool a lot of people and be fine. Okay, so be it. We think that this basically worked, this pretty simple tactic. But they've started advertising their presence through these infographics that Thabat has put out, which is this al-Qaeda-affiliated sort of media group. We say al-Qaeda-affiliated. It probably is part of al-Qaeda, but of course they are sometimes they play little games on what media establishments are really theirs and aren't, and supposedly independent and that sort of thing. But, these infographics are interesting because they're highlighting al-Qaeda's global network and the attacks around the world. So you're talking about in Afghanistan, West Africa, East Africa, Pakistan, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. None of that sounds like an organization that's a shadow of its former self, which is a common talking point we've seen repeated by American leadership through the years. But the interesting thing for us was how many attacks they claimed in Afghanistan, because what they're saying is that al-Qaeda is saying, in effect, that they carried out more operations in Afghanistan in the month of March than anywhere else. That's noteworthy, right, Bill? They don't usually say that sort of thing, and that's something new. I mean, that they would say that.
It is stunning. I mean, we occasionally they slip up and issue a video to show an operation, but al-Qaeda is not advertising its presence because al-Qaeda actually supports the Taliban's efforts to negotiate with the United States in order to get the United States to leave. That's what the Taliban calls it, a withdrawal deal. And al-Qaeda is happy to keep its presence hidden if it achieves that goal. It'll do it whether if they have to fight their way to make it happen, if they have to stay silent on their operations. Their only goal is to get the U.S. to leave so the Taliban can reestablish its emirate. If al-Qaeda's presence is known and they're advertising hundreds of attacks, and Tom, how many attacks did al-Qaeda advertise over the last month?
So according to these infographics, and of course, again, a big asterisk here. We can't verify these numbers. We don't know that they're true. We're just saying it's interesting that they're making this claim, and we think that there's some validity to it. They claimed over 340 operations and killing more than 500 Afghan forces. Usually the casualty figures are inflated, but for their own sort of self-puffery that these jihadis are very interested in. But the 340 plus operations is a lot, right, Bill? I mean, that's a lot of operations. And they also claimed that they were involved in overrunning 11 security checkpoints. Now, there's no way that this level of activity would occur without the Taliban's blessing or without these being joint Taliban al-Qaeda operations. And that underscores the point we've been saying all along, which a lot of policymakers have missed, is that al-Qaeda is deeply embedded in the Taliban insurgency, and the U.S. government has failed, the U.S. military and intelligence services have failed to uproot al-Qaeda from the Taliban insurgency.
Yeah, and that's the key. That's what the Taliban has embedded itself inside the Taliban's military operations, and various designations of Taliban or al-Qaeda military commanders, al-Qaeda bomb makers, and whatnot. You see this. They explicitly state that the Taliban is a force multiplier. I'm sorry, al-Qaeda is a force multiplier for the Taliban by acting as advisors and trainers and all of those things. We see glimpses of this, and it's not just al-Qaeda, right? It's the Turkestan Islamic Party, it's the Islamic Jihad Unit, it's, I could go on and on in the various groups.
They have a whole pantheon of groups that are not accounted for in any of or you are rarely accounted for in sort of the what is al-Qaeda sort of bucket.
And you and I know. I mean, look, we know the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan before it split was a key part of al-Qaeda. We know that the Turkestan Islamic Party, a key part of al-Qaeda, they view it as a jihadist network. And it's
the TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Party, is still functioning in Badakhshan and elsewhere.
Yes,
I mean, it's still a big part, not big part, but it plays a role in the insurgency, in the Taliban-led insurgency, and they openly signal their allegiance to Al Qaeda and the Taliban. I mean, there's really no dispute that this is what this group is. I mean, some try and dispute it, but it's just foolish. But the bottom line is, when you look at all this stuff, I mean, you still have Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who I've been flogging recently on the Afghanistan front because of this withdrawal deal with the Taliban and sort of the assurances he's made on behalf of the Taliban, which is really putting words in the Taliban's mouth. He recently claimed there are less than several hundred sort of Al Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan. And Bill, I mean, how long do we have to cover this? Nobody knows how many Al Qaeda fighters are in Afghanistan, right? I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, that's the first point. Nobody knows. This has been going back years. Nobody's gotten the number right for years. Second thing is, less than several hundred. Actually, the assessments we see that they do make are several hundred, 300 to 600 coming out of the U.S. military and other forces. So it's not less than several hundred; it's actually several hundred. But that doesn't include all the groups you were just mentioning and others. I mean, the point is, and we're going to get into this in the next little bit here, because this video is sort of a juicy target for us to sort of focus on in terms of proving our point. Al-Qaeda has these relationships it leverages with all these groups in the region that are often not accounted for when you talk about, how big Al-Qaeda is. How big is it financially? How big is it in terms of, war fighting or operations? And basically there are basic epistemological issues here that haven't been fixed since I don't know when, basically since the beginning. Right, Bill?
Yeah, and I don't know how many times we've told this story, and I'm going to just tell it really quick here. In 2010, I believe it was Leon Panetta, who was at that time Secretary of Defense, or he was CIA. I don't recall which. He made an estimate.
He was CIA director.
CIA at that time.
Yeah.
Okay, and he estimated there was 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda fighters.
This was on ABC this week. Yeah.
Yes.
It went on ABC this week. Yeah.
This number kept getting repeated. One of the things we did is we tracked U.S. military operations against Al-Qaeda. You'd see 47 Al-Qaeda killed in a camp in Kunar, 10 here, 5 detained, this, that. So we start looking at this going, there's something not right. And then every time they spoke, every year, that number never changed, 50 to 100, 50 to 100, 50 to 100. And we're looking at it going, and we're looking at operations spanning over half the provinces in probably about 60 to 70 districts. There's no way that Al-Qaeda can be spread this thin and being killed or captured at the levels the U.S. military was reporting on. Now, by the middle of 2013, the military just stopped reporting on it. I've been told that was partly because of our reporting at the Long War Journal, that it was sort of killing this narrative. Because look, there had to be only 50 to 100 Al-Qaeda if the Obama administration
wait a minute,
wanted to pull out of Afghanistan.
Are you saying big DOD was not honest about what was going on in Afghanistan? I mean, how can that be, right? I mean,
it's shocking, but true.
Yeah, are you telling me that the assessments have been wrong for years and nobody knows what the hell they're doing? I mean, how's that possible? And
the sad thing is there's very fine individuals within DOD and within the intelligence that do know the right answer to this.
Yeah, and they're
overridden for political.
They're not representing the senior ranks. Yeah,
exactly. And so what happens is, then all of a sudden in October 2016, the U.S. military conducts a raid against
2015.
2015. Yeah,
yep. 2
Al-Qaeda camps in a district called Shorabak in Kandahar. This is a district right along the border of Baluchistan province in Pakistan. One of these camps was later described as Al-Qaeda's largest camp since 9/11. Not in Afghanistan, but Al-Qaeda's largest camp anywhere in the world since 9/11. And the number I believe that was given, I heard anywhere from 150 to 200 Al-Qaeda fighters were killed during this operation. And
killed then captured,
killed or captured, right? Then the number is changed upwards. Well, maybe it's upwards of 300. And then you and I are sitting here saying,
You mean the assessment changed from 50 to 100? They basically added the capacity of the Shorabak camps and said, okay, maybe it's up to 300. Okay, thanks, guys.
And our answer to that is, maybe you don't know what you're talking about, right?
But they didn't go back to the fundamentals. That's the point. I mean, this is the thing. I always imagine, and this is probably self-aggrandizing, but if Ken Burns were to ever sit down and say, hey, guys, I want to do a documentary on the Afghan war, I'd say, Ken, do we have a story for you? And it would basically be, there's a lot of aspects to this war, but you know what? Guess what? the U.S. government hasn't been able to count al-Qaeda or actually figure out what al-Qaeda looks like in Afghanistan for years, for as long as we can remember. And it's basically they're just not going to get it right. I've given up on trying to get official assessments that actually reflect basic facts, and that's sort of how you know the war is basically lost. But in any event, so we have senior Trump administration officials citing these estimates as if they prove something and they don't. But what's great is that. They're not great. It's horrific, but it's the truth of the matter is that the jihadis are going to keep fighting anyway, and they're going to start revealing more and more of what they're doing in Afghanistan as the U.S. pulls out. And this Pakistani Taliban video that came out just recently, this sort of was a video that highlighted so much of what we've talked about in terms of how al-Qaeda is embedded within the fabric of these groups, and this is what makes it difficult to account for, and leads to some of the epistemological problems we've highlighted. And why don't you talk a little bit about this video? Because I know you got excited when you saw it, not because it was groundbreaking in terms of content, but because they just were putting it out there, right, in terms of visuals that justified or illustrated, I'll say, our analysis through the years.
Yeah. So look, in last week in episode 5 of Generation Jihad, which is banned in Pakistan, if you recall, Long War Journal, we've been banned in Pakistan for 8 years for our reporting on all of the problems there. Tom and I, we delved into that murky and incestuous world of the Pakistani and Afghan jihadist groups, Pakistan's role in keeping them afloat, the wheel of jihad, and as if by fate, the day that banned in Pakistan dropped, the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan released a video tribute to Haki Mullah Masood. Haki Mullah was the second emir of the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan and arguably the most influential. He was the guy responsible for the takeover of all of the Fatah, the tribal agencies, and expanded operations into the Northwest Frontier Province, brought in more fighters, conducted attacks against general headquarters in Rawalpindi against the Pakistani military, horrific suicide attacks. Very effective. The U.S. eventually killed him in 2013 in a drone strike.
But by the way, this is why we call it the Wheel of Jihad, right? I mean, so the idea here is that this video demonstrates, and the operations you just rattled off demonstrate that the Pakistani establishment, military intelligence establishment, supports certain jihadist groups, including the Afghan Taliban and others, that are allied with the Pakistani Taliban. So take the Haqqanis, for example, and Sirajuddin Haqqani, Siraj Haqqani is featured in this video with his face mysteriously blurred out once again, standing behind Haki Mullah Masood praying. But Siraj Haqqani runs a network that's supported and is very cozy with the Pakistani military intelligence establishment. Meanwhile, he's in bed with Haki Mullah Masood and his successors in the Pakistani Taliban who are attacking the Pakistani state. So this is the Wheel of Jihad, right? I mean, the Pakistani state supports certain Taliban guys, which you explained last week so eloquently, or in terms of this good Taliban versus bad Taliban mantra they have. But the good Taliban's in bed with the bad Taliban that's coming back against the Pakistani state. So this is why it's the Wheel of Jihad.
Yeah, it was beautiful, not because of the video itself. I mean, these guys are land pirates with horrible grooming habits, but from our perspective as analysis, this just confirms everything we're talking about. Not only Mullah Sangin Zadran, he used to be the Taliban's shadow governor in Paktika province in Afghanistan. He was a deputy to Siraj Haqqani. He's meeting with Haki Mullah Masood, and it's a very, all these meetings, by the way, very collegiate. They're laughing and exchanging jokes and putting on their scarf and all this stuff. Just yet, you don't have these meetings, these relationships without very close groups. And we've seen it over time. We've seen press reports of the Haqqanis coming in to settle disputes at one point there was a dispute between the Masood tribe and members of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan over some settlement issues. The Haqqanis come in and iron out these types of issues. And when you see these videos, you're like, yeah, we know the answer here. So, this is, there's another aspect in here, Tom, and there's one scene where they talk about how early on, and this was after the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, how they're getting fighters from around the world, including Arabs, and that's, of course, is a nod to al-Qaeda. That's how they refer to al-Qaeda. You'll see an individual's name is Tahir Yuldashev in this video. They highlight him. He used to be the head of the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, which is by all accounts, not by all accounts, it was an al-Qaeda branch, an al-Qaeda affiliate, basically al-Qaeda's branch in Uzbekistan.
Although some have tried to dispute that, but there's, it's funny. There's, in fact, one of the things in the Bin Laden files, it's funny, is that there was one of these texts that came from a jihadi that was sort of disputing the IMU, the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan's ties and relationship with al-Qaeda. Was sort of the al-Qaeda response to that. It was pretty funny, actually. Saying, it was responding to the author saying, wait a minute, buddy, you know that we, sponsored them and funded them and trained them. What are you talking about, But again, IMU, which went through these several iterations and has been broken up because of the ISIS, basically the leader of IMU defected ISIS at one point. He then gets hunted down by the Taliban, suspiciously enough, on behalf of al-Qaeda, obviously, and then splits, and then IMU is reorganized. There's a whole history here on this group, but the bottom line is that this was a group that there's plenty of evidence that it was within the al-Qaeda fold, that its sort of remnants or restructured, or how it's reconstituted now in the region is almost certainly still in the al-Qaeda fold. And again, it's another example of where this is the type of thing that was not and has not been accurately assessed or put into assessments of al-Qaeda's strength in the region. And this video shows you all these guys coming together sort of under one banner.
Yeah, it's really... again, it's nothing we don't know. I mean, I remember I saw a couple comments on Twitter going, well, duh. But it's very rare that they show you this. There's one where Haki Mullah and Tahir Yuldashev, and we believe another commander of the IMU, who later rose to be their military commander. Now, Yuldashev was killed in 2009, so this had to be before then. It shows basically what I have no other way to interpret it is we just looked at a deputies meeting there, because at that time that video was taken, Haki Mullah was the deputy emir to Baytullah Masood, the founder of the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan. Tahir Yuldashev, while head of the IMU, he's an al-Qaeda representative. He's probably on their shura, or if not, leading in another capacity. You just don't see that. They don't advertise this in that type of way. In that type of way in their day-to-day propaganda. It usually takes something like a video tribute to Haki Mullah Masood in order for us to glean this information.
And Haki Mullah Masood, just for brief context, is the guy who, as leader of Pakistani Taliban, and of course this video highlights the Pakistani Taliban's attacks or plots against the U.S., including the attempted Times Square bombing in 2010, I think it was, May 2010.
Yeah, May 2010.
Haki Mullah Masood is the guy who was interested in giving you personally, Bill, a hat tip to say that we did this. We talked about this before, so we don't need to go into all the details again. But there's sort of an interesting personal angle watching this video. This is when the bombing happens in Times Square and everybody's trying to figure out who did it. This guy had his media team send you the video saying the Pakistani Taliban did it. So that's why it was an interesting thing. But, you mentioned too, Bill, that we came out with Banned in Pakistan, the 5th episode last week of Generation Jihad. And this video drops concurrently with that episode. You know what this video also concurrently dropped with by the Pakistani Taliban? It dropped with Zalmay Khalilzad and General Miller going to meet with the Pakistani military establishment in Pakistan, Islamabad. And these guys, they put out a statement from the U.S. Embassy there basically praising Pakistan's efforts in the so-called peace efforts here with the Taliban. And I just thought it was somewhat ironic because you have this Pakistani Taliban video come out the same day. And, of course, Siraj Haqqani is featured heavily there with Haki Mullah Masood. And Siraj is the Pakistanis guy. Haqqani's been in bed with the ISI, the military intelligence establishment in Pakistan, for years. And so here you have the crux of the problem. You have the U.S. now, and certainly Khalilzad, as you highlighted, knows better, and certainly other U.S. officials should know better, that the Pakistani military establishment sort of sits at the top of this sort of wheel of jihad, sponsoring the Haqqanis, who are then in bed with all these guys. And it just sort of illustrates the whole problem, right, in the whole war, and basically why this effort is as screwed up as it is.
Yeah, and one more quick point on this. This video also shows the early days of the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan. The Pakistani Taliban, so Haki Mullah and another guy named Abdullah Masood, who basically was the leader of, he was a Gitmo detainee, by the way. Once we freed him, he came back and organized 5,000 fighters, brought them into Afghanistan. Haki Mullah came with them. They fought alongside a commander named Mullah Dadullah, who was arguably the most influential Afghan Taliban military commander. He's revered. There's I
think he was also, wasn't Dadullah, he was also very fond of al-Qaeda from his public life.
Absolutely. The Mullah Dadullah front mimics al-Qaeda's suicide tactics, but also shelters al-Qaeda. Look, when we killed Asim Umar in Helmand, you can bet that was the Mullah Dadullah Front that was sheltering Asim Umar, who was the head of al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. That legacy lives on. So, it shows those really direct ties, not because, look, people want to say Siraj Haqqani, well, he's really just part of his own group. Well, no, he's the deputy emir of the Afghan Taliban, but it's not just the Haqqani network. These guys went in, fought alongside Afghan Taliban commanders. They said they fought in Helmand and Paktika and Uruzgan and Kandahar and Khost. And so they, these Taliban groups they're operating on both sides of the border. They're a threat to both countries, and Pakistan's playing favorites amongst the Talibans is they've tried to ride that tiger, and they're directly complicit in the murder of their own citizens.
So I think one last thing on this video, I think there were some Turkestan Islamic Party guys in there too. I'm not sure if we mentioned that. I think
yes.
Did we identify them? I don't even remember.
Was not able to identify. No, I have some suspicions, but I hate to make.
In any event, we know from other reports anyway that TIP, the Turkestan Islamic Party, they're embedded in the fabric of all this just as well. But it just underscores again and highlights the cross-pollination between these groups in northern Pakistan and Afghanistan. In any event, so we got that. There's a nice cheery Pakistani Taliban video, which you can see Bill and Caleb Weiss, who works with us on this stuff. They had a nice write-up about the video. I'm going to do some more, I think, on Siraj Haqqani and how that sort of disproves the whole Taliban, his whole role in this, and how that disproves the Taliban withdrawal deal that the State Department has been pitching. Finally, we got an ISIS update this week. And this came across the wires in the last 24 to 36 hours before we started working on the sort of outline for what we were going to talk about this week. And this is pretty interesting. The German government says they've broke up a plot by 4 suspected ISIS members who were planning to attack American military bases or facilities in Germany itself. Now, all 4 of them have been identified as citizens of Tajikistan, and their ringleader is an imprisoned jihadist who is also from Tajikistan. Now, these guys supposedly joined ISIS, according, again, these are all allegations, in January 2019. So that makes them latecomers to the game. When you think about joining ISIS in January 2019, you're not exactly joining the winning caliphate at that point. But in any event, they joined in January 2019, according to German prosecutors. And their cell leader, the guy who's sort of pulling the strings on this stuff, he's in prison just a few months later in March 2019. But apparently they keep on plotting. They keep on going. And eventually, at first they have sort of this idea to go after Americans in Tajikistan. And then they ultimately decide to go after American military personnel in Germany, according to what the German government is saying. Now, there are several aspects of this that are interesting. The first one is the German government says these guys were in touch with 2 senior members, ISIS members in Syria and Afghanistan. Now, Bill, that sort of illustrates, again, assuming that's true, and of course I haven't seen these 2 senior members identified yet, but it shows you yet another example of where what happens in Afghanistan doesn't stay in Afghanistan, regardless of what Secretary Pompeo and Zalmay Khalilzad will tell you about their Taliban deal, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, you have a couple of groups that were Afghan based, the Iman Barkhari Brigade and Islamic Movement Uzbekistan, that have branches inside of Syria, and they're active and they issue information. And also
in Afghanistan. And
yes,
as you documented back in the days, the Uzbeks were involved in those plots in Germany themselves on behalf of al-Qaeda.
You read my mind. I mean, this isn't the first time we've seen something like this. So I suspect that this is all part of that network. And we have to remember the Islamic Movement Uzbekistan split in half, and half of it joined the Islamic State. So it probably inherited the parts of that network that enabled, the contacts for this particular plot to go through. It's really fascinating when you see, and Tom, you said, well, they joined at the time when the caliphate's at its nadir, but these groups don't look at it this way. They don't look at it like, oh, we're losing now. Their timeline isn't this year, next year, 3 years from now. It's 20 years, it's 30 years, it's 50 years. They realize, they know they're the underdogs. It's part of their whole
sometimes
whole mythology, and that they're going to take this fight as long as it takes, because and that's what they feed off of that.
Well, there's also the personal aspect of all this. I mean, in this case, they're not Uzbeks, as we've documented in the past. They're actually Tajiks, and I thought that was interesting because there is a Tajikistan story here about what's going on with ISIS, which kind of comes through in several of these recent events. I mean, you have this plot, which was all citizens of Tajikistan. And you remember, Bill, going back to July 2018, you remember when a mock news agency, the ISIS news agency, came out with this video of these 5 young men or adolescents, some of them maybe even been boys. They had driven their vehicle into these foreign cyclists in Tajikistan. They then jumped out of the car and started stabbing the cyclists with knives. This is sort of the ISIS MO. They want believers everywhere around the world to do this, and they did this. They had a follower or an online follower who did this in Ohio State. They've had people do this in London. They've had people do this all over the place. And these guys, this team of young men or adolescents or even children, did this in Tajikistan, and they killed 4 people, including 2 Americans doing this. And so Amaq releases this video of them afterwards, of these guys swearing allegiance to Baghdadi. I remember talking about it at the time, thinking, that signifies that they have at least a cell or cells in Tajikistan or of Tajiks. And then, going forward on this, a year later in July 2019, there's this monitoring team that does great work for the UN Security Council. Even when we don't agree with necessarily all of its conclusions or what it's reporting, there's a lot of meaty details, or at least telling what member states of the UN are what they're seeing in terms of what's going on in the jihadi threat. And so these monitoring team reports are always great to read, and I recommend everybody do them. We cover them at Long War Journal when we can. Well, in July 2019, one of these came out, and it had details about ISIS's efforts to recruit a base of Tajiks, citizens of Tajikistan in Afghanistan. And it identified one of the premier ISIS Khorasan members in Afghanistan as being somebody from Tajikistan, and said that he sat on the Shura Council and he had 200 jihadists from his country in Afghanistan under his control. I mean, that's interesting. I mean, that tells you that they've really been building up their sort of base from Central Asia in Afghanistan. And then they have, on top of that, we've been tracking the role of young men from Tajikistan who were involved in attacks in Afghanistan itself, including this March 6th attack in Kabul, where ISIS attacked this memorial service for Abdul Ali Mazari, who was an ethnic Hazara leader who was killed by the Taliban in 1995. But the Taliban doesn't go after these memorial services for Mazari anymore, but ISIS does. This is a couple years now in a row they've gone after this thing in this ceremony in Kabul, and dozens were killed or wounded in this attack. And so what's interesting is when they identified who was responsible, ISIS said that one of them was this guy Ahmad al-Tajiki, I think was what they identified him as. I mean, his kunya or his nom de guerre, basically meaning he's from Tajikistan. So, Bill, there's a story here from Tajikistan with these guys that's connected all the way around the world now, where you can see that, again, what happens in Afghanistan doesn't necessarily stay in Afghanistan. There's a lot of details we have to work out here, but you can see that ISIS is recruiting from Central Asia just like al-Qaeda.
Yeah, and when you look at what the Russian response to all of this is this is sort of what's interesting. Russia often gets accused of hyping up terrorist threats, particularly in the Caucasus, right? The big argument was, no, there's no jihadists, they're just separatists. And then, of course, we know that that's true. The Russians are really concerned and are doing things like providing local Taliban groups along the border with arms and weapons because of this particular problem, this rise of jihadism in the former Soviet republics like to Uzbekistan and Tajikistan and elsewhere. So, we know there's a problem. It's easy to dismiss the Russian concerns as overhyping the problem, but
yeah, and I mean, look, the Russians do all sorts of nasty stuff. I mean, of course, yeah. I mean, they do use. I mean, Putin's used this for his own advantages, and there's all sorts of legitimate concerns there. But the point is, it doesn't mean that these guys. Yeah,
there is something in the middle, and I always as you and I discussed numerous times in private conversations, that Chechnya there was very radical, violent terrorist groups there that were part of al-Qaeda's network. The Russians brutally suppressed it, but just because there were also Chechen separatists doesn't make a jihadist a separatist. They can be different breeds, and there is a rising problem particularly in Tajikistan, that needs to be addressed.
And then you have another ISIS-related story that popped up in recent days, really earlier this month. The Afghan forces said they detained Aslam Faruqi, who they identify as the emir of ISIS Khorasan. Now, what's interesting about that is that same report I just mentioned, that from that UN monitoring team in July 2019, talked about how Faruqi was actually named as the replacement for his predecessor, a guy known as Abu Ammar al-Khorassani, because Khorassani was the ISIS central leadership, the mothership in Iraq and Syria, determined that Khorassani had poor performance, basically. He was a sort of an underperforming jihadi leader. And so they named Faruqi as a replacement. This was in that UN report as well. And so that shows you, that's one of, I think, many reports we have now showing that ISIS central leadership does exercise a degree of command and control over its so-called affiliates or provinces at given times. The Afghans identified Faruqi as the guy who was responsible for this attack on a Sikh temple in Kabul in late March, where about more than 24 civilians were killed. And, just as we were about to start recording today, Bill, what was interesting is you see some reports coming out of the Indian press and elsewhere talking about the guys who were around Faruqi in his cell and in his operations, including one guy who was being identified. And we're going to look into this more probably for future episodes, but a guy who was, so there's a long profile going all the way back to the 1990s involved in the Kashmiri Jihad and separatism there. What's interesting about that is that, of course, when you looked at this attack on the Sikh temple in Kabul in March, one of the things that came up was that they identified the attacker, the principal terrorist, as somebody who was from the Indian subcontinent. They gave him the nom de guerre al-Hindi, basically, and they said that he was acting in revenge for the Muslim Brothers in Kashmir. This again shows that ISIS is using Afghanistan or has designs from Afghanistan on the surrounding regional
and by the way,
countries.
so in talking with various individuals and from India, they dispute this. They don't believe that's true. That they believe is that they're using that as a recruiting tool and as a way to sort of pin the blame on India. Now, again, Indian security services have their own reasons for an Indian not to be involved in this attack. But, you have a lot of, sometimes you have wheels within wheels on this, but you're absolutely correct. The fact is, Afghanistan is a jump point for al-Qaeda's operations everywhere, and negotiating with the Taliban isn't going to solve this problem. Yeah.
Well, the other thing is, ISIS could very well be using this to recruit. I definitely think that's the case, but there's no doubt they have a sort of upstart presence in Indian-controlled Kashmir. I don't know how anybody can deny that. There's obvious evidence around that. So, saying they're using this to recruit, okay, fine, yeah, I agree, but that doesn't disprove that they have this presence in Indian-controlled Kashmir. It's not a major presence. It's not something that rivals, really, the Pakistani-backed jihadist groups. It's not clear in terms of how big al-Qaeda is there, but ISIS certainly has a presence there.
To be clear, I was merely communicating what I've heard. Now, look, we know there's been attacks inside India carried out by Indians. There was the Indian Mujahideen, which was basically a front for Lashkar-e-Taiba, but we know that individuals that carried out that attacks were Indian citizens. So, I just wanted to let you know what we're hearing from what I'm hearing from outside, and that it's a very controversial issue within the Indian security establishment.
Yeah, well, all I could say to everybody who's involved in this is the facts are what they are, and just always follow the facts. And the reason why the Afghan war is as screwed up as it is because so many American policymakers didn't follow the facts for years, and that's a big part of the reason. Also, of course, this constant turnover in military leadership and others, and we'll have to again. I'm waiting for the call from Ken Burns, and hopefully that comes someday. That's my that's a joke, folks. In any event, finally, I was going to do a little bit of a segment on this, and I don't really have much to say about this other than just to point to it as a sort of a tying a bow on the ISIS part of this show this week. It's interesting. We've been following all these reports coming out of Syria, and ISIS is still engaged in some pretty heavy fighting against the Assad regime and its allies in eastern and central Syria. They're obviously not at the peak of their power in Syria, but there's quite a bit going on there, and we're hopefully going to document that going forward. But again, it's an example of you have this case where the Germans say that they just cracked down on a cell comprised of citizens from Tajikistan who were in contact with ISIS leaders in both Syria and Afghanistan, while at the same time ISIS is continuing to fight in Syria. Involved in some pretty heavy fighting, and I just think that's sort of a picture of an organization that they're not near the peak or the pinnacle of their power, but boy oh boy, they're still alive and they're still in the game. So we'll wrap it up there for this week. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Generation Jihad. As Bill and I have said, we're going to have guests in the future. We're still lining them up. In the era of the coronavirus, that tends to be a little bit more difficult than you would suspect, for making sure that people have the right equipment and make sure the sound is okay for everybody to listen to. We're trying our best here to work through all of our own little technical glitches. Of course, I am a technophobe, if you know me at all, and there's always a chance that I will screw up everything when it comes to recording these episodes. So Bill and our colleague Phil Hegseth have been doing wonders to basically keep me on the rails. In any event, please do subscribe to the show if you're a fan of it. If you don't like it, well, then don't subscribe. And as a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows, and we'll see you next week.